Our second speaker tonight is Peter Tsai, who is the editor of China Spectator, which is part of Business Spectator. Prior to this, he was at The Age covering Asian affairs and telecommunications. He has degrees from Adelaide and Oxford, was previously a policy officer at the Federal Treasury, where he worked on foreign investment and trade policy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As an economic journalist in Australia, I think I should start every presentation with the iron ore price. At the moment, it's hovering around about $40, and it's pretty hard for you to be bullish about the Chinese economy when iron ore prices are trading at $40. It can be said that the President Xi Jinping inherited the Chinese economy possibly at the worst time. So when he was become the Secretary General of the CCP, China's golden decade just ended. So before that, it grew around about double digit. So when he took over, it was about 7.7. Now this year, in 2015, there's a lot of doubts about whether China can even deliver 7%, which is a bit inconceivable just a few years ago. During the GFC, we had a great time. That China had this massive $4 trillion stimulus package, RMB stimulus package, combined with a $10 trillion credit expansion, saved a lot of people, including Australia, Brazil, BHP, Rio Tinto. They all have a lovely time. But courtesy of that, it created a lot of problems for Xi Jinping. The problem number one is a well-known problem about local government debt. Before China implemented the package, China was in a very fiscally strong position. And since the GFC stimulus package, China's local debt, at a most conservative estimate, increased from 3.9 trillion to 10.8 trillion. So that was the most conservative estimate according to China's National Audit Office. But if you look at the various estimates from Merrill Lynch or from McKinsey, the picture is much worse. And so basically China's local debt increased quite dramatically during that time. Now we have a large problem to deal with. And also, not just local government debt, you have a look at the Chinese corporate debt, according to S&P, if you still believe them after GFC. The credit rating deteriorated significantly. Once again, before 2007, the Chinese company were in a very strong financial position, significant cash flow, very little leverage. But after the GFC, and they borrowed very heavily, so now the Chinese corporate debt is actually larger than the United States. So it's something like $13 trillion. And so that's a quite large problem for China. Local government debt, corporate debt, all courtesy of the massive stimulus package. And the second one is associated problem with an excess capacity. Just to give you an example, what a big problem China has is, if you look at the Hebei province, next to Beijing, a very polluted place. It's basically home to 7 out of 10 most polluted city in China, very unpleasant. It's the second largest producer of steel in the world after China. It produced 185 million tons, 23 times Australia's national production, larger than combined output of Japan and South Korea, just one province. And they're churning out so much stuff that no one wants. It's completely depressed the international market for steel product. And that's why we're enjoying a relatively low inflation. That's why, that's one of the reasons the world is having a problem of deflation, thanks to massive, productive capacity in China. So the Chinese government really want to curb that excess capacity. As you can imagine, is a huge problem. Hebei province alone is being tasked with an almost impossible task to reduce 60 million tons in steel production by 2017. To give you a sense of how difficult it is, if they can carry through that task, 200,000 people will lose their job directly. Another 400,000 will lose their job indirectly, as you can imagine. The local officials are not really willing to carry out this task. So it's problem number 2. Just want to mention 2 problems. I don't want to get you too depressed on a Monday night. As you can imagine, China has more problem than I just mentioned. So how does Xi Jinping, or his team decide to take on this challenge? So at the end of 2013, and the government published a very comprehensive 60 points reform program. It is really heartening to say that, to say the blueprint is quite impressive. But like any other strategy, the implementation is the most tricky and the difficult part. So in this session, I will address 3 to 4 problems, depends on time. So let's start with the local debt. It's quite an epic problem, so let's start with that. So how does Chinese government deal with this problem? And first, to its credit, it has not used these old tricks. So, if you read a financial paper, there's endless speculation. China will engage in another round of stimulus package. I think most of the time you can ignore it because I think lots of people just speculate. They just think every time when there's a problem in China, the standard solution is to open the purse and all the problems will just disappear. But to the credit of China's central bank and to the leadership team, they have not engaged in another round of irresponsible credit creation. So, especially the central bank governor is quite an impressive guy with very solid economic credential. So he's been holding firm on that front. So that's a good one. The second one is if you look at the problems in terms of local government debt, the first thing you want to get a true size. You want to get a sense of how big the problem really is. So China's National Audit Office has been doing a reasonable job in doing that, but I think the numbers must be truly scary. So they basically told all the provincial government, so you have to go back, look at your book again, because some of the numbers you give us are just incredible on many different fronts. Either they're too high or too little, or so they don't believe their own number. So the latest round, so I think by end of last month, so all the provincial governments supposed to hand in their latest figure, and they're supposed to be absolutely accurate because they were used as a benchmark for all the future policy making. Guess what? It's quite scary. Only one province, Hainan province, so they revised their figure. Guess what? It's about close to 1/3 higher than their original number. Why they come clean on this? Because the central government is going to implement a debt swap program. So they're going to basically replace all their murky, short-term, high-interest debt with central government-backed, low-interest, low-maturity program. So it's a bit of incentive for them to come clean on their dirty laundry. So guess what? They decide to kind of air their soiled underwears, and it's quite scary. So Hainan is the first one to come out with the true figure, I think. And we're waiting to say whether more provinces will come out with more scary numbers. It's probably likely. So, like I mentioned earlier, the debt swap program, I think, is the first concrete step to actually deal with the local debt program problem. So because if you look at the figures, official figures, there's a massive repayment crunch coming the first half of the year. So with the debt swap program, at least they can push back the problem just a bit. So the local government have a bit of a maneuver space to actually deal with the problem. And so another element of their debt, how to solve the debt strategy is basically to use this wonderful thing called PPP. I think is a lot of, I suppose, business opportunity for Macquarie advisors to go to China and advise them on the wonderful PPP program. I can tell you in China is not that attractive at the moment. The response is a bit underwhelming because, as you all know, the PPP requires a pretty sound legal system. When you have the government who can arbitrarily take away your properties and your assets and etc., it doesn't look quite attractive at the moment. So, more work on PPP later. So that's a debt program. That's kind of the first one. I think they're making some pretty good progress. And the second one, just to give you a bit of optimism in China, is the financial sector reform. There have been a lot of reform in this area. The first one, let me start with insurance deposit scheme. It will actually start next month, so it's good news. China has been talking about it for 20 years, so finally it's going to happen. So why it is important is the first thing is basically for a very long time, everyone just assumed the Chinese government will pick up the tab at the end, so all the financial institutions, banks, and etc. all assume that Beijing will be, going to pick up the tab at the end. So all of them act quite irresponsibly in terms of lending to local government, to the companies, and etc. So create a well-known problem of a moral hazard. Now they're going to introduce insurance deposit scheme. So it just means basically all the deposit up to 500,000 RMB, about 100,000 Australian dollars, will be covered. So what does it mean in the future? I think Beijing will allow some selective defaults. This will teach a lesson about moral hazard. So a very useful lesson. So that's number one. That's the first reason to be optimistic about financial sector reform. The second one is interest rate liberalization. I'm going to introduce a concept called financial repression here. So for a very long time, it simply means Chinese banks enjoying a very fat margins without doing much work. So the Chinese banks are some of the worst managed in the world, but they have some of the healthiest profit margin. So they've been enjoying that for very many years. The poor depositors in China, Chinese depositors have to put up with this. So the wonderful industrialization process in China can happen. So all this credit being channeled into Chinese factories, and etc., especially state-owned firms, they enjoy very cheap credit. So that is likely to end in 2 years' time. If we can believe the promise of the Chinese central bank governor, there are some tentative steps have been taken. At the moment, they remove the cap on the lending rates, but that's not important. The most important one is the deposit one. At the moment, they can move up to about 20% of the benchmark price. So in the future, so within 2 years, hopefully, the Chinese central bank can fully liberalize the interest rate. When that happens, we present the Chinese savers with a lot more option than what they are currently having at the moment, which is not much. So if that happens, that will be a huge landmark in terms of Chinese financial sector reform. One thing that is actually pushing this along are the wonderful companies like Alibaba. I think they are racking in deposit at the rates of something like 4 million RMB a second or something. I can't remember the exact figure. The money market fund they are running is close to 1 trillion RMB. Just because you can shift your money at like that, and they give you a very attractive deposit. So as a result, the Chinese savers are putting money into this money market fund run by Alibaba, by all these internet giants in China. So it's giving them an additional impetus to reform. I think this is going to happen. Had an interview with the chairman of the Construction Bank of China when he was in Australia. He actually said his bank, second largest in China, is actively preparing for the day when the interest rate liberalization is going to happen, because at the moment their largest profit center relies on this financial repression, relies on this guaranteed profit margin thanks to the central bank. But at the moment they are going to all the kind of different areas, aircraft leasing, private wealth management, and etc. So they are preparing for the day when this is going to happen. So that's another thing that is quite interesting happening in China. So financial reform looks, of all areas in China, quite optimistic. So on the third problem, how I'm doing with time? Good. Yep. Sorry. SOE reform, state-owned enterprise reform. One of the most tortured areas for reform in China. And this is another one of this litmus test when it comes to how willing is this current government and how determined they are to tackle the reform problems in China. And SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, if you look at a Fortune 500 list, they are some of the most powerful, most well-capitalized companies in the world, oil giants, big four commercial banks, and et cetera, very powerful. And they suck up so much resource from the financial sector, totally inefficient. And if they can be reformed, according to China's own calculation, it can potentially add another 1.5 to 2% to their GDP. That means about 1.5 trillion US dollars in terms of additional productivity, if they can be effective in terms of using their capital, just like their private counterpart. So this is a huge area. A lot of reform, a lot of talk about reform. They're supposed to release some blueprint very soon, but there's only one case I think so far looks promising. Sinopec, one of the largest oil companies in China, is actually going to auction off a large chunk of its retail arm. We're talking about 50,000 petrol stations and how many hundred thousands of shops associated with. And this is actually one of the cash cow of the company. So they invited a lot of private bidders as well, both Chinese and the foreign, to take a part in this. So the idea behind it is it's just not the cash they want, but they want a managerial expertise. So they basically want to introduce a talent into their management system so they can become more efficient. And the second model they are looking at is the Singaporean model, to turn the Chinese state-owned enterprises into capital management company like a Temasek or the Singaporean government investment corporations. So their job, instead of plays a triple role of a regulator, manager, and capital owner. So their job in the future is just going to become, in a way, a capital owner of the company. So they let professional managers to run the firms, and a lot of CCP senior officials, from the organizational department, which appoint all the senior executives in China, and the people from China Investment Corporation made a lot of trips to Singapore to the Temasek headquarters. So that's what they're trying to learn, perhaps implement the Singaporean model when it comes to the reform for the state-owned enterprises. When I'm talking about the state-owned enterprises, one thing that's a bit encouraging is the corruption crackdown in China. You have seen a lot of senior executives from the state-owned sectors have been arrested, especially from the oil sector, connected with the disgraced former security, the head of security in China. So a lot of people think this is actually a bit of a precursor for SOE reform. Let's hope that's true. I think just on the final note, I think another very significant economic policy under Xi Jinping has been just mentioned about Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I think to talk about Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it is not possible to talk about without mentioning Xi Jinping's signature policy, the so-called One Road and One Belt strategy. It's basically about expanding infrastructure investment and the trade and etc. connectivities between China and the Southeast Asian country and China into the Central Asia region. So I think this is one of the most significant international economic initiative from the Xi Jinping. He talked about a lot at different forums, and everyone in China wants to get a piece of the cake. Just to run off my presentation, like one of my friends from university, he's into kind of an agriculture business in China. One day he gave me a call. He said, I want to go to Xinjiang. And I asked him, why did you want to go to Xinjiang? He said, well, haven't you heard about One Road and One Belt strategy? This guy studied accounting at a Deakin and is a kind of interesting small-time businessman. And even he's interested in the grand strategy of One Road and One Belt. It must get a fair bit of attraction in China. So I think on that final note, once again, to give you a bit of optimism, one of my favorite China analysts, a former journalist, no less, Arthur Krob, he actually said, I think it's quite accurate, I agree with him, a lot of the people basically are saying that there's not much sign of reform in China, not much is happening, not much progress, a lot of empty promises. But he said, if you compare what China has done and compared with Obama's administration or other major Western leader, and Xi Jinping actually doesn't look that bad. So I think on the final note, I will leave the stage. Thank you.